A young man stands in the Bastille prison, his only crime writing a few satirical verses about the regent of France. He's 23 years old, born François-Marie Arouet, but he'll walk out of this cell 11 months later with a new name that will echo through centuries: Voltaire. That imprisonment was supposed to silence him. Instead, it ignited a 60-year war against tyranny, superstition, and injustice that would reshape Western thought. This is the story of how one man's pen became more dangerous than any army. November 21st, 1694. Paris is cold, and in a modest house on the Rue Saint-Antoine, a child enters the world so frail that the midwife doesn't expect him to survive the night. His mother, Marie Marguerite d'Aumar, is 39. His father, François Arouet, is a notary who serves wealthy clients and moves in respectable circles. The baby, their youngest, seems destined for a quick baptism and a small grave, but François-Marie Arouet refuses to die. He clings to life with a stubbornness that will define his entire existence. His mother, however, isn't so fortunate. She dies when he's 7, leaving a wound that never fully heals. Years later, he'll write about maternal love with an aching tenderness that suggests he never stopped missing her. His father has plans, practical plans. The boy will study law, join the notary profession, live a respectable bourgeois life, safe, predictable, profitable. Young François-Marie is sent to the Collège Louis le Grand, a Jesuit school where the sons of nobility and wealthy merchants receive the finest education in France. The Jesuits are brilliant teachers, masters of rhetoric and classical learning. They teach him Latin and Greek, introduce him to Cicero and Virgil, train his mind in logic and argumentation. They also teach him something they don't intend. He watches how institutions use fear to maintain control, how authority demands obedience without question, how religious doctrine can be weaponized against independent thought. He's learning, but not the lessons they want him to learn. He excels at verse composition, his facility with language already remarkable. His teachers praise his talent while worrying about his tendency toward irreverence. At school, he befriends boys from aristocratic families. The Duc de Richelieu becomes a lifelong companion. These connections matter in a society where birth determines everything. François-Marie has talent and intelligence, but he's a commoner. These friendships give him access to salons, to conversations, to a world that should be closed to someone of his status. His father remains unmoved by poetic achievement. Law, that's the future. At 16, François-Marie begins legal studies. He hates every moment. The dry precision of contracts and property law feels like a cage. His father secures him a position as secretary to the French ambassador in The Hague. It's 1713. He's 19, and this should be the start of a diplomatic career. Instead, he falls catastrophically in love with Catherine Olympe Dunoyer, a young woman he's absolutely forbidden to see. They exchange passionate letters. They plot to elope. It's the kind of reckless romantic drama that could ruin both their reputations. When the affair is discovered, François-Marie is sent back to Paris in disgrace. The diplomatic career is over before it begins. His father is furious. The boy has wasted an extraordinary opportunity for what? Poetry and unsuitable romance? François-Marie is ordered to work in a law office. He goes through the motions while spending his nights writing verse, attending salons, becoming known in literary circles for his wit and his dangerous tongue. The salons are everything. In these aristocratic drawing rooms, the sharp-minded gather to discuss philosophy, literature, politics, and scandal. Women like Madame de Tencin and the Duchesse du Maine preside over evenings where reputation can be made or destroyed with a clever epigram. François-Marie is brilliant at this game. His conversation sparkles. His verses circulate in manuscript, copied and passed from hand to hand. But wit has consequences. In 1717 he writes satirical verses suggesting that the Duc d'Orléans, regent for the young Louis XV, is conducting an incestuous affair with his daughter. Whether he believes this or simply can't resist the scandalous rhyme doesn't matter. The verses reach the regent. On May 16, 1717, François-Marie Arouet is arrested and imprisoned in the Bastille without trial. The Bastille isn't the hellish dungeon of popular imagination, at least not for prisoners of his class. He has a room, books, writing materials, but he's locked away, his freedom stripped by royal whim. No charges, no trial. Just a lettre de cachet, a sealed letter bearing the king's authority, enough to imprison anyone indefinitely. He spends 11 months in that cell. Some men would emerge broken, cautious, determined never to risk such punishment again. François-Marie Arouet emerges transformed. In prison, he works on an epic poem about Henri IV, the beloved king who ended France's religious wars. He writes a play, Oedipe, reworking Sophocles for the French stage. He's not being silenced, he's preparing. More importantly, he makes a decision. François Arouet is the name of a notary's son, a young man of modest birth who got himself imprisoned for impertinence. That man is dead. The writer who will emerge needs a new identity, a name that belongs to no family, that carries no bourgeois associations. The exact origin remains mysterious, possibly an anagram of Aravet L-Uy, the Latinized spelling of his surname with le jeune, the younger. Or perhaps from a family property, air vault. The truth doesn't matter. What matters is the transformation. When he leaves prison in April 1718, François-Marie Arouet is gone. Voltaire has arrived. His play Oedipe premieres at the Comédie Française in November 1718. It's a sensation. The audience recognises the classical story, but hears new themes, veiled criticisms of tyranny and fate, lines that seem to comment on contemporary politics. Voltaire is suddenly famous, not infamous. The king grants him a pension. The same establishment that imprisoned him now celebrates him. He's learning a dangerous skill, how to say forbidden things in ways that provide plausible deniability. A line can mean one thing on the surface, another to those who understand. This will become his signature method, the technique that allows him to attack power while maintaining just enough distance to survive. But success brings its own perils. In December 1725, Voltaire is dining at the Duc de Sully's residence when the Chevalier de Rohan-Chabot arrives. De Rohan is everything Voltaire isn't. Nobleman, aristocrat by blood, someone who views writers as clever servants. They've clashed before. Tonight, de Rohan mocks Voltaire's adopted name. Monsieur de Voltaire, Monsieur Arouet. What is your name exactly? Voltaire's response is swift and cutting. Whatever my name is, I'm the first to bring honour to it. The room goes silent. You don't humiliate an aristocrat in public. De Rohan leaves, his face burning. Voltaire has won the exchange, but lost something more important. Several days later, Voltaire is called outside the Hôtel de Sully. De Rohan waits in his carriage while his servants beat Voltaire with sticks. De Rohan watches, calling out instructions. Don't hit his head. A poet needs his head. Voltaire, bruised and humiliated, seeks justice. Surely his aristocratic friends will support him? The Duc de Sully refuses to get involved. Others make excuses. The message is clear. You're not one of us, and you never will be. Birth trumps talent. A nobleman can have a commoner beaten in the street, and there will be no consequences. Voltaire challenges de Rohan to a duel. Instead of meeting him, de Rohan has him arrested. On April 17th, 1726, Voltaire is back in the Bastille, not for what he wrote this time, but for demanding the dignity of equal treatment. He's released after 2 weeks on the condition that he leave France immediately and stay at least 50 leagues from Paris. He chooses England. On May 2nd, 1726, Voltaire crosses the Channel, a French poet in exile, heading for a country that will show him a radically different way of organising society. He doesn't know it yet, but these next 3 years will transform not just his thinking, but the intellectual landscape of Europe. The England Voltaire discovers in 1726 is startling. It's been less than 40 years since the Glorious Revolution installed William and Mary on the throne with limited powers. Parliament holds genuine authority. The Bill of Rights protects certain freedoms. Religious minorities, while not fully equal, can worship without fear of massacre. No one is imprisoned without trial by royal whim. Most shocking of all, merchants and writers are respected. Wealth earned through commerce brings honour, not shame. A successful businessman can rise in society. Meanwhile, France still operates on medieval principles, where nobility of blood determines worth, where a talented writer remains fundamentally inferior to the laziest aristocrat. Voltaire meets everyone who matters. He's introduced to Alexander Pope, Jonathan Swift, and other literary figures. He attends performances of Shakespeare's plays, initially shocked by their violence and disregard for classical rules, then increasingly fascinated by their raw power. He visits Isaac Newton's funeral at Westminster Abbey, watching as England buries a mathematician and scientist with honours usually reserved for kings and generals. Newton, that funeral haunts him. In France, Descartes still dominates scientific thinking with his philosophy of innate ideas and mechanical vortices. But Newton has demonstrated something else entirely, that mathematics and observation can unlock nature's laws. Gravity isn't a theory to be debated in salons. It's a measurable force, proven through calculation and experiment. Voltaire meets scientists and learns Newtonian physics. He attends Quaker meetings, struck by their simplicity and their rejection of hierarchical authority. He observes parliamentary debates where ideas, not breeding, determine influence. He sees a society that isn't perfect but is built on fundamentally different principles than his homeland. He's also broke. The money he brought from France runs out. He learns English rapidly, well enough to write in it, and publishes an English version of his epic poem La Henriade by subscription. The subscription list reads like a directory of English society. Nobles, merchants, even the royal family. In England, supporting a poet isn't servitude. It's patronage, freely given, creating no obligation of silence. For 3 years, Voltaire absorbs everything. He's preparing something, though he doesn't yet know exactly what form it will take. He's gathering ammunition for a war he'll wage not with weapons, but with words. In 1729, political conditions shift. The French government signals that Voltaire can return. He's been gone 3 years, long enough for tempers to cool, for the humiliation with de Rohan to fade into old gossip. He boards a ship for Calais, carrying notebooks filled with observations, ideas, comparisons. France looks different now, or rather, he sees it differently. The arbitrary power of nobles, the religious intolerance, the crushing of intellectual freedom, all of it seems more absurd after witnessing an alternative. He begins writing what will become the Lettres philosophiques, known in English as Letters Concerning the English Nation. The work is structured as simple observations about English society, their government, their religious diversity, their treatment of commerce, their scientific achievements. But embedded in every innocent description is a devastating comparison. When Voltaire praises English religious tolerance, the implicit criticism of French persecution is unmistakable. When he celebrates how England honours its thinkers, he's condemning France's treatment of intellectuals. He knows this is dangerous. The manuscript circulates privately for years before he dares publish it. While he waits for the right moment, he rebuilds his literary career in France. Plays, poems, histories, anything to re-establish himself and generate income. He needs financial independence because he's learned the crucial lesson. Artists dependent on patronage can be controlled. Then he discovers something that will change everything. The lottery. France in 1728 operates a national lottery, and it has a fatal flaw. The government needs money, always needs money, and someone devises a scheme. Sell bonds that pay monthly interest, then add a lottery component. Bondholders can buy additional tickets for a chance to win a large prize. The idea is to make the bonds more attractive, but the mathematician who designed the system made a mistake in the prize structure. The payout ratio is wrong. If you buy enough tickets relative to the total pool, you're guaranteed to win more than you spent. Voltaire spots this immediately. Numbers have always been his second language after words. He sees what the government bureaucrats don't. This isn't gambling, it's arbitrage. The problem is scale. You need capital to exploit the flaw, enough money to buy sufficient tickets that the mathematics works in your favour. He can't do this alone. Enter Charles-Marie de la Condamine, a mathematician and adventurer who has made the same calculation. Together, they form a syndicate. They recruit others, pool resources, and begin systematically buying tickets. Month after month, their syndicate wins. Not every drawing, that would be suspicious, but often enough that the returns are staggering. The government notices eventually, launches an investigation, but the syndicate has broken no laws. The lottery's rules are public. Exploiting stupidity isn't illegal. By the time the government shuts down the lottery and redesigns it, Voltaire has made nearly 1 million livres. He's 35 years old and financially independent for life. This matters more than any literary prize ever could. Money means freedom. Freedom from patrons, from royal pensions that can be revoked, from the need to soften his words to avoid offending whoever pays his bills. He can now write exactly what he thinks. He invests carefully. Loans to nobility at interest, shares in shipping ventures, speculation in grain supplies. He becomes, by any measure, wealthy, and he's shameless about it. Money isn't vulgar to Voltaire, it's power, and power exercised through finance is cleaner than power exercised through birth or violence. With his fortune secured, he returns to the manuscript he's been afraid to publish. The Lettres philosophiques is ready. It's dangerous, certainly, but he's no longer vulnerable in the same way. The book appears in 1734, published simultaneously in English in London and French in Amsterdam, keeping the actual printing outside French jurisdiction. The reaction is immediate and explosive. The Parlement of Paris orders the book burned by the public executioner. Copies are thrown into bonfires outside the Palais de Justice. The government issues a warrant for Voltaire's arrest. He's charged with scandalous libel against religion and the state. He flees Paris hours ahead of the police. Where does a fugitive philosophe hide? Voltaire goes to Cirey, a dilapidated chateau in Champagne, near the border with Lorraine. It belongs to the Marquise du Châtelet, and this requires explanation. Émilie du Châtelet is 28 years old when Voltaire arrives at her crumbling estate. She's married, a mother, and bored to the point of desperation by provincial life. She's also a mathematical prodigy, fluent in Latin, English, and Italian, and passionately interested in Newtonian physics at a time when almost no one in France takes Newton seriously. They become lovers, intellectual partners, and collaborators in one of the strangest domestic arrangements of the century. Voltaire pours money into renovating Cirey. He builds a laboratory for Émilie's physics experiments, a library stocked with thousands of books, a theatre for staging his plays. The chateau becomes a private academy, isolated from Paris but connected to the intellectual currents of Europe through correspondence. They work side by side. Émilie translates Newton's Principia Mathematica into French, adding her own mathematical commentary. The work won't be published until after her death, but it remains the standard French translation centuries later. Voltaire writes histories, plays, scientific treatises. He studies physics under Émilie's guidance, she being the superior mathematician. Together they conduct experiments on the nature of fire, submitting papers to the Academy of Sciences. This is the period when Voltaire transforms from a clever poet into a systematic thinker. Émilie forces intellectual rigor on him. She won't let him get by on wit alone. She demands evidence, mathematical proof, logical consistency. It's also a strange domestic situation. The Marquis du Châtelet, Émilie's husband, visits occasionally and seems unbothered by his wife's relationship with France's most famous writer. This is aristocratic marriage, as practical arrangement, not romance. The Marquis has his own interests. Everyone is civilized. 15 years. Voltaire spends 15 years at Cirey from 1734 to 1749, the longest he'll ever stay in one place. They're productive years, safe years, hidden from the authorities in Paris who gradually lose interest in prosecuting a case that would only give the book more attention. He writes Zadig, a philosophical tale set in ancient Babylon about a man trying to understand why the just suffer and the wicked prosper. It's entertaining enough to avoid immediate censorship, but carries questions about divine providence that make theologians nervous. He writes essays on Newtonian physics, helping introduce English scientific thought to French readers. He writes histories, attempting a new approach that focuses on culture, commerce, and ideas rather than just kings and battles. And he writes constantly for the theatre. Tragedies mostly, in the classical style, because that's what brings fame in 18th century France. His plays are performed in Paris even while he's officially in exile. The contradiction bothers no one. France runs on contradictions, but isolation has costs. Paris is where reputations are made, where intellectual battles are fought, where you defend your ideas in salons and academies. Cirey is comfortable but peripheral. Then in 1745, something shifts. Louis XV needs a royal historiographer, someone to chronicle his reign in appropriately flattering terms. Despite everything, despite the warrant and the burned books and the years of exile, Voltaire gets the appointment. He returns to Paris. He's even elected to the Académie Française, the ultimate symbol of literary respectability. The rebel has been domesticated, or so it appears. He hates it. Court life requires constant attendance, flattery, navigating factional politics. He's expected to celebrate military victories he considers pointless, praise a king he finds mediocre, and keep silent about anything controversial. The very things that made him dangerous now have to be suppressed. He tries. He writes court entertainments, royal celebrations, everything expected of an official historiographer. But he can't maintain the performance. His private letters mock the people he publicly praises. He makes enemies through careless wit, offends the king's mistress, alienates powerful courtiers. Then Émilie dies. It's 1749. She's pregnant at 42, a dangerous age for childbirth in the 18th century. The baby is born and dies within days. Émilie develops fever, probably puerperal sepsis, and dies less than a week after giving birth. Voltaire is shattered. Whatever their arrangement was, lover or partner or intellectual companion, she was the person who understood him, challenged him, made his work better. She saw him not as a performing monkey or a useful propagandist, but as a mind. He writes to his niece, "I have not lost a mistress, I have lost half of myself, a soul for which mine was made." Paris becomes unbearable. Cirey is full of ghosts. He needs somewhere else, somewhere he can work without the suffocating attention of the French court. Frederick the Great, King of Prussia, has been writing to Voltaire for years. Flattering letters, philosophical discussions, invitations to visit Berlin. Frederick styles himself an enlightened monarch, a philosopher king who reads voraciously and composes music and wants the greatest minds of Europe at his court. Voltaire has resisted previous invitations. Kings are dangerous, even intellectual ones, maybe especially intellectual ones. But now, grief-stricken and exhausted, he accepts. In 1750, he travels to Berlin to become Frederick's honoured guest, his intellectual ornament, his court philosophe. it will prove to be a catastrophic miscalculation. Frederick is brilliant, charming, and genuinely devoted to philosophy and the arts. He's also an absolute monarch with the temperament of a tyrant and the ego of a demigod. At first, it's wonderful. Voltaire has apartments in Frederick's palace at Potsdam. They dine together daily, discussing philosophy, literature, and politics. Frederick shows Voltaire his poetry and philosophical writings. Voltaire offers suggestions, usually diplomatic ones, though not always. The problem emerges gradually. Frederick doesn't want a colleague, he wants an ornament. Voltaire is meant to add luster to the Prussian court, to make Frederick look enlightened by association, but he's not supposed to have independent interests or opinions that conflict with royal policy. Voltaire starts speculating in Saxon bonds, a financial scheme that technically violates Frederick's trade policies. It's legal, but embarrassing. Frederick is furious, not about the money, but about the appearance that his guest is profiteering. Then Voltaire makes a worse mistake. He gets into a vicious literary dispute with Pierre-Louis Maupertuis, the president of Frederick's Academy of Sciences. The argument is about physics, specifically about the principle of least action. It's technical and petty and escalates wildly. Voltaire writes a devastating satire mocking Maupertuis, titled Diatribe du Docteur Akakia. It's cruel, funny, and completely undermines the dignity of Frederick's hand-picked Academy president. Frederick orders all copies seized and burned. Voltaire promises to comply, then secretly keeps printing more copies and distributing them. This is the moment the relationship breaks. Frederick realizes Voltaire can't be controlled. Voltaire realizes Frederick values obedience over truth. Each feels betrayed by the other. The final break comes in 1753. Voltaire asks permission to leave Prussia. Frederick grants it, but with deliberate humiliation. Voltaire is detained at Frankfurt, which is outside Prussian territory, but where Frederick's agents can still reach. His baggage is searched, papers are confiscated, supposedly looking for a book of Frederick's poetry that Voltaire shouldn't have. He's held for weeks, treated like a criminal, robbed of money and possessions by Frederick's agents. When he's finally released, Voltaire is 59 years old, homeless, and banned from both Paris and Berlin. The two great capitals of Enlightenment Europe are closed to him. He needs a refuge outside France, but close enough to stay connected. He needs a place where he can write freely without immediate fear of arrest. And ideally, he needs somewhere beautiful. He finds it on the border between France and Switzerland, Ferney. The estate sits just inside French territory, but close enough to Geneva that he can cross into Switzerland within minutes if French authorities come looking. It's perfect defensive positioning for a philosophe at war with orthodoxy. He buys the property in 1759 and begins the final, most productive phase of his life. Ferney transforms from a struggling rural village into a centre of enlightened enterprise. Voltaire establishes watchmaking workshops, employing refugees and skilled craftsmen. He drains swamps, improves roads, builds houses. The village population grows from 50 families to over 1,000 people. He's playing enlightened lord, demonstrating that rational management and religious tolerance create prosperity. It's both genuine improvement and propaganda, showing what philosophe principles look like in practice. And from this base, he launches the most sustained campaign of intellectual warfare the 18th century will see. He publishes constantly. Philosophical tales, pamphlets, histories, plays, and above all, letters. Thousands of letters to correspondents across Europe, creating networks, spreading ideas, coordinating campaigns. He signs many of them "Écraser l'infâme," crush the infamous thing. The infamous thing is religious fanaticism, superstition, intolerance, all the forces that suppress human reason and freedom. Voltaire has found his mission, and he prosecutes it with relentless energy. His weapon isn't systematic philosophy, He's not building grand metaphysical structures, like Leibniz or Spinoza. His weapon is the surgical strike, short, devastating works that mock absurdity, expose injustice, and make the irrational look ridiculous. The Dictionnaire philosophique appears in 1764. It's an encyclopedia of skepticism, arranged alphabetically, each entry a small bomb. Under atheism, he argues that atheists can be moral, maybe more consistently moral than religious hypocrites. Under tolerance, he demolishes every argument for religious persecution. Under miracles, he applies withering logic to supernatural claims. The book is condemned, burned, banned. He publishes it anonymously, denies authorship unconvincingly, and watches it spread across Europe in pirated editions. But the work that will define his legacy is just beginning. Triggered by an injustice so grotesque, it demands response. On October 13th, 1761, in the French city of Toulouse, a young merchant named Marc-Antoine Calas was found dead in his father's shop. He'd been strangled. Within hours, rumour turned to certainty in the streets. His father, Jean Calas, had murdered him to prevent his conversion to Catholicism. Jean Calas was a Protestant, a Huguenot, in a city where Protestants lived under constant suspicion. The revocation of the Edict of Nantes in 1685 had made Protestantism illegal in France. Those who remained faced restricted rights, social stigma, and periodic persecution. Toulouse was particularly hostile, its Catholic establishment zealous in defending orthodoxy. The authorities arrested Jean Calas, his family, and a dinner guest. The evidence was thin, contradictory, built on nothing but religious prejudice. Marc-Antoine had likely killed himself, depressed over debts and failed business prospects. But suicide was both a crime and a mortal sin. Admitting it would mean his body would be dragged through streets and dumped in a pit. The family initially tried to hide the suicide's nature to preserve his dignity. This hesitation became proof of guilt. The prosecution spun an elaborate narrative. Jean Calas, fanatical Protestant, had discovered his son's intention to convert and murdered him in religious fury. Never mind that there was no evidence of conversion plans. Never mind that Marc-Antoine had shown no interest in Catholicism. Never mind that strangling a healthy 28-year-old man would require accomplices, and the supposed accomplices were an elderly mother and a younger brother. The Parlement of Toulouse, the regional court, convicted Jean Calas. The sentence was execution by breaking on the wheel, one of the most agonizing deaths in the repertoire of French justice. On March 10th, 1762, 64-year-old Jean Calas was taken to a scaffold in front of the church of Saint-Étienne. The executioner bound him to a cartwheel. Using an iron bar, he systematically broke Calas's limbs, arms, legs, thighs, shoulders. 2 hours of methodical torture designed to extract a confession before death. Calas maintained his innocence throughout. He was strangled after the breaking, his body burned, and his property confiscated. His family was destroyed, daughters forced into convents, wife stripped of possessions, son fled into exile. News of the case spread slowly beyond Toulouse, dismissed initially as local justice in a provincial city. Then it reached Ferney. Voltaire heard about the Calas case in March 1762, the same month as the execution. His initial reaction was caution. He'd learned through decades of controversy not to trust first reports. Maybe Calas was guilty. Religious fanaticism existed among Protestants as well as Catholics. He began investigating, writing letters, gathering information from sources in Toulouse and from Calas's surviving son, who'd escaped to Switzerland. The more Voltaire learned, the clearer the picture became. This wasn't justice, this was judicial murder, religious persecution dressed in legal robes. No evidence, no credible motive, just prejudice and hysteria. A court had tortured and executed an innocent man because of his religion. Voltaire was 68 years old. He could have stayed silent, continued his comfortable existence at Ferney, avoided a fight with the French judicial system. Instead, he declared war. He began writing. Letters first to everyone who mattered: magistrates, ministers, intellectuals, nobility. He presented the facts methodically, dismantling the prosecution's case piece by piece. He published the Traité sur la tolérance, ostensibly about the Calas case, but expanding into a comprehensive argument against religious persecution. The work is devastating. Voltaire traces the history of intolerance, showing how Christians who once begged Romans for tolerance became persecutors themselves, once in power. He demonstrates that religious diversity doesn't threaten social order. Persecution does. He argues that tolerance isn't just morally right, but practically necessary for peace and prosperity. He writes with controlled fury. The prose is clear, logical, building an irrefutable case, but underneath runs white-hot rage at injustice, at cruelty sanctified by religion, at institutions that torture old men for crimes they didn't commit. And he doesn't just write, he organises. He raises money for the Calas family. He coordinates with lawyers to pursue legal appeals. He mobilises public opinion across Europe, turning the Calas case into an international scandal. Frederick II in Prussia, Catherine II in Russia, intellectuals in London and Amsterdam all follow the case, all express outrage. This is something new. A philosophe using celebrity and network to challenge state power directly. Not through abstract philosophy, but through concrete intervention in a specific injustice. Voltaire is inventing what we'd now call human rights advocacy, leveraging public opinion to pressure authorities. The French government is furious but constrained. Voltaire is too famous to arrest directly, too well connected to silence. His location at Ferney, right on the Swiss border, makes him physically untouchable, and the case he's building is too strong to ignore. He writes a pamphlet titled Histoire d'Elisabeth Canning et de Jean Calas, distributing it widely, ensuring everyone in France with any education knows the details. He corresponds with Madame Calas, the widow, treating her with respect and compassion while using her story to maximum effect. The campaign lasts 3 years. Slowly, the pressure builds. Legal experts begin questioning the verdict. The Paris Parlement, rival to Toulouse's regional court, shows interest in reviewing the case. Moderate voices in the Catholic establishment start distancing themselves from Toulouse's zealotry. In March 1765, the Royal Council orders a retrial. The Toulouse verdict is annulled. By June, the full exoneration comes. Jean Calas was innocent. The court had murdered an innocent man. The family's honour is restored. Their property returned, compensation paid. Voltaire has won. A single writer, operating from a country estate, has forced the French judicial system to admit catastrophic error. It's unprecedented, but he's not finished. The Calas case proved the method works. He immediately takes on new cases of judicial injustice. In 1765, a young nobleman named the Chevalier de la Barre is arrested in Abbeville. His crime? Failing to remove his hat during a religious procession and allegedly damaging a crucifix. The evidence is questionable. The punishment is monstrous. De la Barre is convicted of blasphemy, sentenced to have his tongue cut out, his right hand cut off, then to be burned alive. The sentence is partially commuted. Instead of tongue and hand, he's merely beheaded before burning. He's 19 years old. The authorities burn a copy of Voltaire's Dictionnaire philosophique alongside de la Barre's body, linking philosophie dies to blasphemy, sending a message to Ferney. Voltaire receives the message. He escalates. He writes Relation de la mort du Chevalier de la Barre, documenting every detail of the case, showing the absurdity and cruelty. A boy executed for not removing his hat. This is what religious fanaticism produces. He takes on the Sieven case, another Protestant family destroyed by false accusations and judicial prejudice. He works on it for 9 years, finally winning exoneration in 1771. Each case follows the same pattern: meticulous investigation, clear presentation of facts, mobilization of public opinion, relentless pressure on authorities. And each victory demonstrates that écraser l'infâme isn't just a slogan, it's a program. What drives this? Why does an elderly writer, wealthy and comfortable, spend his final years fighting battles that bring him nothing but enemies and danger? Partly, it's temperament. Voltaire can't tolerate injustice, especially stupid injustice, injustice that serves no purpose except satisfying prejudice and cruelty. His mind rebels against it, the way a mathematician rebels against a false proof. Partly, it's philosophy. He genuinely believes reason can defeat fanaticism, that exposing absurdity weakens it, that progress is possible if enlightened people fight for it. And partly, it's personal. He's been persecuted himself, beaten, imprisoned, exiled. He knows what it means to be powerless before arbitrary authority. Now he has power, the power of fame and intellect and network, and he's using it to protect others who lack it. The campaigns transform his reputation. He's no longer just a clever writer, a wit who mocks everything. He's a moral force, a defender of the innocent, a champion of justice. The young philosophes in Paris, the generation coming up, Diderot and d'Alembert and their circle, they revere him. He's become the patriarch of the Enlightenment, the embodiment of its highest ideals. But there's ambiguity here too. Voltaire's tolerance has limits. He despises religious fanaticism, but he's contemptuous of atheism. He believes society needs religion to maintain order, even if the religion is rationally indefensible. His famous line captures the contradiction. If God did not exist, it would be necessary to invent him. He fights judicial torture and execution, while accepting that some forms of hierarchy and inequality are natural and necessary. He defends Protestants and Jews from persecution, while making casual anti-Semitic remarks in his writing. He champions reason, while profiting from investments in slave trading ventures. These contradictions don't erase his achievements, but they complicate the picture. Voltaire is a man of his century, not ours. His enlightenment has boundaries, blind spots, areas where prejudice persists, despite philosophical commitment to reason and tolerance. Still, the Callus campaign and its successors established something crucial: the principle that state power must justify itself, that courts must answer to reason and evidence, that public opinion can challenge institutional authority. These are seeds of the French Revolution, though Voltaire won't live to see them sprout. From Ferney, he continues writing at inhuman pace. More plays, more histories, more philosophical tales. He corresponds with Catherine the Great of Russia, advising her on legal reforms. He writes questions sur l'encyclopédie, expanding and radicalizing the Dictionnaire philosophique. He publishes essays on everything from crop rotation to criminal justice. His energy is astonishing for a man in his 70s. He's always been physically frail, complaining constantly about health problems, convinced he's dying. Yet he outlives nearly everyone, working 14-hour days, producing thousands of pages annually. Ferney becomes a pilgrimage site. Visitors from across Europe make the journey to meet the great man. He receives them graciously, performing the role of philosopher king in his miniature, enlightened kingdom. Some visitors are disappointed, expecting more gravitas, finding instead a thin old man who jokes constantly and performs his own plays with amateur enthusiasm. Others understand that the performance is the point. Voltaire has always known that ideas spread through personality, that philosophy needs theatre. He's playing the roles of Enlightenment sage because the role itself is propaganda, demonstrating that reason and wit and tolerance can coexist, that serious thought doesn't require grim solemnity, By the mid-1770s, Ferney is more than a residence. It's a symbol, a counter-capital to Paris and Versailles, a place where philosophe principles actually govern. People who've never visited know about it, cite it in arguments, imagine it as a kind of secular monastery where truth is pursued without interference from throne or altar. Voltaire's relationship with the wider philosophe movement is complex. He's the movement's celebrity, its most famous representative, but he's also apart from it. The Paris philosophes meet regularly, collaborate on the encyclopédie, form a coherent intellectual community. Voltaire is isolated at Ferney, corresponding but not participating directly. He's suspicious of system building, of grand metaphysical theories. Diderot and D'Holbach are pushing toward explicit atheism and materialism. Voltaire thinks this is strategically foolish and philosophically unjustified. He remains a deist, believing in a creator God who set the universe in motion, but doesn't intervene in human affairs. His philosophical tale, L'Ingénu, appears in 1767, satirizing French society through the eyes of a Huron native brought to France. It's vintage Voltaire, quick, funny, devastating. The innocent outsider exposes the absurdities of civilization, showing how customs that seem natural are actually arbitrary and often cruel. But his greatest tale is behind him now. Candide, published in 1759, is the work that will outlive everything else. It's his masterpiece, the perfect distillation of his worldview into a short, savage, hilarious narrative. The tale mocks Leibnizian optimism, the philosophy claiming this is the best of all possible worlds. Candide suffers every catastrophe imaginable: war, earthquake, shipwreck, enslavement, torture. His tutor Pangloss continues insisting everything is for the best even as everything gets worse. The satire is merciless. The ending has puzzled readers for centuries. After all the horror, Candide doesn't embrace pessimism or despair. He simply says, "Il faut cultiver notre jardin." We must cultivate our garden. What does this mean? Is it resignation, retreat from engagement? Or is it practical wisdom, the recognition that we can't fix everything, but we can improve our immediate circumstances? Is the garden literal, metaphorical, both? Perhaps it's Voltaire's final answer to the problem of evil and suffering. Grand philosophical systems can't resolve it. Optimism is absurd, pessimism is paralyzing. What remains is work, improvement, cultivation. Not the whole world, but our garden. Not cosmic justice, but local amelioration. It's modest ambition, but Voltaire's life demonstrates what modest ambition can achieve. The Calas case was one garden cultivated with extraordinary effect. Now in his late 70s, Voltaire is preparing to return to Paris after 28 years of exile. Paris, 1778. The city hasn't seen him in nearly 3 decades, and now he's coming back at 83 years old, frail, possibly dying, but determined to witness one final triumph. The journey from Ferney takes a week. Voltaire travels in a custom carriage, wrapped in furs despite the February cold that seems to penetrate everything. His secretary Wagner accompanies him, worried constantly about his health. They should have waited for spring, but Voltaire insisted. There's a new play to oversee Irene, and he wants to see it staged. More than that, he wants Paris. He's been away too long. When the carriage enters the city on February 10th, word spreads instantly. Voltaire is back, the most famous writer in Europe, the man who challenged kings and popes, the philosopher of Ferney, has returned. Within hours, his lodgings at the Hôtel de Villette are besieged. Visitors arrive in waves. Admirers, old friends, curiosity seekers, sycophants. The great Benjamin Franklin comes, representing the new American Republic, and asks Voltaire to bless his grandson. Voltaire places his hands on the boy's head and pronounces in English, "God and liberty." The moment becomes famous instantly, repeated in salons across Paris. 2 revolutions meeting, one nearly finished, one just beginning. The Academy holds a special session in his honour. When Voltaire enters, the members rise and applaud. He's overcome, weeping openly, something those who know him find shocking. Voltaire doesn't weep, but he's 83 and this is Paris. And the recognition, after so many years of exile, breaks something loose. The real event is Irene. The play itself is mediocre. Everyone knows this, even Voltaire probably. But that's not the point. The point is the occasion, the spectacle. On March 30th, the Comédie Française stages it with Voltaire in attendance. The theatre is packed beyond capacity. People stand in the aisles, crowd the doorways. When Voltaire enters his box, the performance stops. The entire audience turns, applauding, shouting. The actors on stage join in. It continues for several minutes, wave after wave of adulation. Someone places a laurel crown on his head. He removes it, embarrassed, but they put it back. The performance finally resumes, but no one is really watching the play. They're watching him. After the final curtain, the cast brings out Voltaire's bust and crowns it with laurels on stage. The audience goes wild again. It's coronation, canonization, triumph. Voltaire is smiling, but he's exhausted. The energy required to receive this much adoration is immense. His health collapses within days. Too much excitement, too many visitors, too little rest. He's been drinking enormous quantities of coffee, 40 cups a day according to some accounts, trying to maintain the energy for constant socializing. His body finally rebels. He develops a cough that won't stop, pain throughout his abdomen, difficulty breathing. Doctors are summoned. They prescribe various remedies, all useless. By mid-May, everyone close to him understands. He's dying. The church wants his soul. A priest arrives, urging confession and last rites. Voltaire has spent 60 years mocking the church, writing devastating satires, fighting clerical power. Now they want him to recant, to die reconciled, to give them the propaganda victory of his deathbed conversion. He refuses, but he's also practical. He knows what happens to those who die unreconciled. No Christian burial, body thrown in a pit, estate complications for his heirs. So he signs a carefully worded statement, acknowledging he dies in the Catholic faith, but it's vague, minimal, giving the church nothing they can really use. On May 30th, 1778, he dies. Not dramatically, not with famous last words, just the gradual shutdown of a body that's lasted 8 decades. His secretary and a few friends are present. Paris learns within hours. The church immediately demands the body be refused burial in Paris. He died unreconciled despite the statement, they argue. It's not sufficient. But Voltaire's friends move quickly. His nephew, the Abbé Mignot, has the body transported that very night to the Abbey of Celières in Champagne, where Mignot is abbot. They dress Voltaire upright in the carriage, so he appears alive to anyone who might check at city gates. By the time the church realizes what's happening, he's buried in consecrated ground. The authorities fume, but it's done. Paris erupts in debate. Half the city mourns a genius, the other half celebrates the death of an enemy of religion. Pamphlets flood the streets, some praising, some condemning. The philosophes mourn genuinely. Diderot, d'Alembert, Condorcet all write tributes. The king and court remain silent, officially pretending nothing significant has occurred. But they're nervous. Voltaire's death doesn't end his influence. If anything, it concentrates it. He becomes pure symbol now, no longer complicated by actual personality. The question everyone's asking is what comes next. Voltaire dominated intellectual life for 60 years. Who replaces him? What does the Enlightenment look like without its greatest publicist? The answer is already forming, though few recognize it yet. A new generation is rising, more radical than Voltaire ever was. Men who consider his deism cowardly compromise, his political caution inadequate. They want revolution, not reform. They've read Rousseau more carefully than Voltaire, and they're about to get their chance. But before we reach the deluge, we need to understand what Voltaire actually accomplished. Not the myth, not the symbol, but the tangible effects of one man's 60-year campaign against l'infâme. The direct legal victories are easiest to count. Jean Calas rehabilitated, his family compensated. The Sirven family saved from similar persecution. The Chevalier de la Barre's case, though it failed to save the boy, sparked reforms in how blasphemy cases were prosecuted. Torture in judicial proceedings, while not eliminated, was increasingly questioned and restricted. These weren't accidents. They happened because Voltaire made them happen, mobilizing public opinion through his correspondence networks and published appeals. The indirect effect spread wider. Voltaire made criticism of religious authority socially acceptable in elite circles. Before him, you could privately doubt, but public skepticism risked serious consequences. After him, fashionable Paris treated faith as optional and clergy as fair targets for mockery. This shift didn't cause the revolution, but it removed one barrier to imagining radical change. His writing style influenced everyone who came after. The philosophical dictionary became the model for how to popularize complex ideas through brief, witty entries. Candide demonstrated that philosophy could be entertainment, that serious arguments could hide inside funny stories. Generations of writers absorbed this lesson, understanding that reaching large audiences required more than logical rigor. You needed narrative, humor, style. The concept of the intellectual as public advocate, using fame to intervene in political cases, starts largely with Voltaire. Writers had been court dependents or church dependents or worked in obscurity. Voltaire showed you could be independent, commercially successful, and politically influential. You could live by your pen and speak truth to power. Not safely, not easily, but possible. Zola defending Dreyfus, Sartre signing manifestos, Chomsky opposing war. They're all downstream from Voltaire's example. But there's a darker legacy too, one his admirers prefer to ignore. Voltaire's tolerance had limits. His anti-Semitism, expressed repeatedly throughout his work, was vicious even by 18th century standards. He portrayed Jews as superstitious, greedy, inferior. When defending Calas, he attacked fanaticism generally, but reserved special venom for Jewish examples. His campaign for tolerance was explicitly Christian tolerance, not universal human rights. He wanted Protestants protected, not a secular state that protected everyone equally. His views on race were standard Enlightenment prejudice elevated to philosophical principle. He argued for polygenesis, the theory that different races had separate origins and were essentially different species. Africans were inherently inferior in his view, a position he used to justify slavery while simultaneously criticizing its cruelty. The contradiction didn't trouble him. His feminism, often praised because he supported education for women and featured intelligent female characters, was superficial. He enjoyed the company of educated women, benefited from relationships with powerful ones like Émilie du Châtelet, but never questioned the fundamental social structures keeping women subordinate. When push came to shove, women were decorative, emotional, useful as muses, but not as equals. These weren't incidental flaws in an otherwise progressive thinker. They were structural limits to Enlightenment universalism. The rights of man meant the rights of European Christian men, expanded reluctantly and partially to include others. Voltaire's tolerance was revolutionary in context, but it rested on assumptions about hierarchy and difference that would poison liberal thought for centuries. Still, judging 18th century figures by 21st century standards is its own kind of anachronism. The question isn't whether Voltaire meets modern criteria for acceptable thought. It's what he changed in his own time. Whether his interventions move things forward or back. The answer is clearly forward, despite the caveats. Religious persecution in France declined significantly in the generation after Voltaire, not because authorities became more enlightened, but because the intellectual and social climate shifted enough that enforcement became difficult. You can trace this directly to the work of Voltaire and his allies. Legal reform accelerated. Torture was formally abolished in 1780, 2 years after his death. The Criminal Ordinance of 1670, which had governed French justice for a century, was increasingly recognised as barbaric and arbitrary. Reform commissions were established. The changes came slowly, but they came. Voltaire's treatises on judicial reform, his public campaigns around specific cases, created pressure that authorities couldn't fully ignore. The Church's political power entered terminal decline. In 1773, the Jesuits were expelled from France entirely, their property confiscated. This wasn't primarily Voltaire's doing. The Jesuits had many enemies, but the intellectual groundwork making their expulsion thinkable and defensible drew heavily on decades of Voltairean criticism. Print culture exploded. The number of books published annually in France doubled between 1750 and 1780. Illegal works, the kind Voltaire specialised in, circulated widely despite censorship. Reading rooms and lending libraries spread through provincial cities. The Republic of Letters that Voltaire inhabited his entire career expanded into something approaching a mass reading public. Revolutionary ideas would find this infrastructure ready when they needed it. So when we ask what Voltaire accomplished, the answer has layers. Specific legal victories for specific people, yes. Broader cultural shifts around religious authority and intellectual freedom, definitely. A writing career that demonstrated philosophy could be popular and profitable, absolutely. A model of the engaged intellectual using fame to pursue justice, clearly. And an example of Enlightenment thought's limitations, its blind spots and prejudices, undeniably. His influence on the revolution that came 11 years after his death is debated endlessly. Conservatives blamed him directly, claiming his impiety and mockery destroyed respect for authority and made the terror possible. Revolutionaries claimed him as inspiration, even transferring his remains to the Pantheon in 1791 in an elaborate ceremony celebrating Enlightenment values. Both sides exaggerated his importance, making him responsible for, or vindicated by, events he didn't live to see. The truth is more complicated. Voltaire was a reformer, not a revolutionary. He wanted the ancien regime improved, not destroyed. He supported enlightened monarchy, not popular sovereignty. If he'd lived to see 1789, he likely would have welcomed the initial reforms, the Declaration of Rights, the constitutional monarchy, and he almost certainly would have been horrified by what came after. The king's execution, the terror, the wholesale destruction of old institutions. But ideas escaped their author's intentions. Voltaire spent 60 years attacking the foundations of traditional authority, questioning divine right, mocking church power, demanding justice based on reason rather than tradition. You can't do that for 6 decades and then act surprised when someone decides the whole structure should come down. The revolution wasn't caused by books, by Voltaire or Rousseau or any philosopher. It was caused by fiscal crisis, social tension, political deadlock, crop failures, and 1,000 other material factors. But revolutions need vocabularies, conceptual frameworks, ways of imagining alternative arrangements. Voltaire provided those, not alone but prominently. The revolutionaries who cited him weren't wrong to see him as an ancestor, even if they'd taken his ideas places he never intended. The old man's final years became a strange kind of theatre. Everyone knew Voltaire was dying, and everyone wanted a piece of the spectacle. He'd returned to Paris in February 1778, after 28 years of self-imposed exile, supposedly to see his latest play performed. The city went mad for him. Crowds gathered wherever he appeared. The Academy held a special session in his honour. Benjamin Franklin brought his grandson to receive the great philosopher's blessing, and Voltaire obliged by placing his hands on the boy's head and pronouncing in English, "God and liberty." It was exactly the kind of performance he'd perfected over 8 decades, but his body was failing. He was 83, racked with pain, barely able to eat. The church, sensing an opportunity, sent priests to extract a deathbed conversion. This was standard practice, the final chance to save a heretic soul and publicly demonstrate the church's triumph over impiety. Voltaire played along just enough to keep them at bay without fully submitting. He signed a vague statement acknowledging God and asking forgiveness for any offence, but refused the full confession and communion the priests demanded. It was his last act of defiance, wrapped in apparent compromise. He died on May 30th, 1778. Immediately, the question of burial became a crisis. Church law forbade Christian burial for anyone who died without full reconciliation. The priests who'd attended him claimed he'd refused the sacraments. His supporters insisted he'd done enough to qualify. While the authorities debated, Voltaire's nephew, the Abbé Mignot, made a decision. He had the body dressed in a nightcap and placed upright in a carriage, propped between 2 servants, as if the old man was simply sleeping during a journey. The carriage left Paris before officials could intervene. They drove east for 3 days to the Abbey of Céllières in Champagne, where Mignot was prior. The abbot there, presented with Voltaire's corpse and Mignot's insistence that proper protocols had been followed, agreed to burial. Voltaire was interred in the Abbey church before anyone from Paris could object. The Bishop of Troyes, when he found out, was furious and demanded the body be exhumed. Too late. Church law protected bodies already buried in consecrated ground. Voltaire had pulled off one final trick, smuggled into Christian burial through a combination of speed, deception, and bureaucratic loopholes. The revolution changed everything. By 1791, the new National Assembly was busy creating a secular state and needed symbolic heroes. Voltaire fit perfectly. He'd attacked the church's power, defended victims of injustice, championed reason over superstition. Never mind that he'd been a monarchist who'd have hated their politics. They needed him as an ancestor, and the dead can't object to being claimed. On July 11th, 1791, the Assembly voted to transfer Voltaire's remains to the Panthéon, the former church of Sainte-Geneviève, now repurposed as a secular temple to France's great men. This required digging him up from Céllières and transporting him back to Paris with appropriate ceremony. The procession was spectacular. The coffin was placed on an elaborate catafalque, styled after an ancient sarcophagus, gilded and decorated with his most famous quotes. It took 11 days to travel from Champagne to Paris, stopping in towns along the route for ceremonies and speeches. Thousands turned out to watch. In Paris, the procession stretched for hours. Every revolutionary faction wanted representation. National Guardsmen, representatives from the sections, members of learned societies, students from the schools, delegations from theatres where his plays had been performed. They carried banners with quotations. He avenged Calas, Labarre, Sirven, and Montbailly. He taught us to be free. The coffin passed through the ruins of the Bastille, the ultimate symbol of the old regime's tyranny, now demolished. Workers had constructed a temporary monument there from Bastille stones, and the procession paused while singers performed hymns to liberty. At the Panthéon, the building itself had been transformed, Christian symbols removed, new inscriptions added. Above the entrance, "To the great men, the grateful fatherland." Inside, Voltaire's coffin was placed in the crypt, alongside Mirabeau, the revolutionary orator who died earlier that year. Voltaire, who'd spent his life carefully navigating between reform and revolution, was now claimed entirely by the revolutionary cause. The irony would deepen. In 1794, during the Terror, Robespierre would invoke Voltaire while sending thousands to the guillotine in the name of virtue. Later, when reaction set in, critics would blame Voltaire's mockery and skepticism for destroying the moral foundations that might have prevented such bloodshed. Neither interpretation quite fit the man who died 16 years before any of it happened, but posthumous reputations follow their own logic. Across the Channel, reactions to Voltaire's reburial split along predictable lines. Edmund Burke, already horrified by the revolution, saw the Pantheon ceremony as proof of France's descent into atheistic madness. Here was a nation honouring a man who'd spent his life attacking religion and morality, celebrating the very intellectual poison that had led to regicide and chaos. For Burke, Voltaire represented everything wrong with Enlightenment thought taken to its logical conclusion. Others disagreed. Mary Wollstonecraft, defending the revolution against Burke's attacks, saw Voltaire as a champion of reason whose work had helped expose the corruption of old institutions. If France was struggling to build something new that didn't invalidate the critique of what had existed before, Thomas Paine, writing The Age of Reason while imprisoned during the Terror, drew heavily on Voltairean arguments against religious authority even while the revolutionaries who'd honoured Voltaire were executing each other. The 19th century couldn't decide what to do with him. Romantics found him cold and mechanical, too rationalist, lacking the passion and imagination they valued. Victor Hugo praised him as a warrior for justice, but criticised his artistic limitations. Conservatives continued blaming him for the revolution. Catholics saw him as the arch-enemy, the man who'd done more than anyone to undermine faith. Liberal reformers claimed him as inspiration for fighting injustice and championing free expression. His books remained controversial. Candide was still banned in many places through the 1800s. The Philosophical Dictionary was on the Vatican's index of prohibited books until the index itself was abolished in 1966. Yet these same works were taught in universities, translated into dozens of languages, circulated widely in cheap editions. You could find Voltaire in opposite contexts, banned as dangerous and assigned as classic literature. What survived most durably was the idea of Voltaire more than the actual content. The image of the fearless intellectual speaking truth to power, using wit and reason to fight injustice, defending victims against corrupt institutions. This archetype proved extraordinarily useful across different political contexts. You could invoke Voltaire whether you were a French liberal in 1830, an American abolitionist in 1850, a Russian reformer in 1905, or a civil rights activist in 1960. The specific arguments mattered less than the model of engaged intellectual activism he represented. His actual philosophy aged less well. The deism that seemed radical in 1750 looked quaint by 1850. His faith in progress through reason and commerce felt naive after World War I. His prejudices about non-European peoples became increasingly embarrassing as colonial empires collapsed. The casual anti-Semitism that he'd shared with most of his contemporaries was recognised as exactly that: prejudice, not philosophical insight. Reading Voltaire in the 20th century required constant contextualisation, explanation, apology, but the cases endured. The story of Jean Calas became a permanent reference point for discussions of judicial murder and religious persecution. Law students still studied it. The Calas affair appeared in textbooks on legal reform, histories of human rights, surveys of Enlightenment thought. Voltaire's intervention had transformed a local tragedy into a universal example, and that example outlived all his philosophical writings. The same pattern held for Labarre. The Chevalier's execution became shorthand for religious fanaticism and the abuse of blasphemy laws. 19th century anti-clericals erected monuments to Labarre as a martyr to free thought. Towns renamed streets after him. His case was invoked in debates over secularization, church-state separation, freedom of expression. Voltaire's advocacy had given Labarre's death a meaning it wouldn't otherwise have possessed, transformed him from a reckless youth into a symbol. By the late 19th century, something interesting happened. Voltaire became respectable. The French Third Republic, thoroughly secular and committed to Enlightenment values, could embrace him without reservation. Schools taught his works. Statues went up in public squares. The government commissioned a complete critical edition of his writings, eventually running to over 200 volumes. He was now safely historical, his radicalism absorbed into the mainstream of Republican thought. This domestication came with costs. The sanitized Voltaire of Third Republic textbooks lost the edge, the anger, the calculated outrageousness that had made him dangerous. Students learned about his fights for justice, but not always about his methods. The manipulation, the strategic lies, the willingness to use any weapon available. The respectable Voltaire was easier to teach but less interesting than the actual man had been. World War II complicated everything. The Vichy regime, collaborating with Nazi Germany, attacked Enlightenment thought generally, and Voltaire specifically, as part of the intellectual poison that had weakened France. Traditional Catholics saw an opportunity to settle old scores, blaming the defeat on decades of secularization and anti-religious teaching that had sapped national vitality. Voltaire's works were removed from some school curricula. Streets and squares named after him were renamed. After liberation, his reputation recovered quickly. The Fourth Republic returned to Third Republic values, and Voltaire came with them. But something had shifted. The confidence in progress through reason that had characterized 19th century Voltaireanism was harder to maintain after Auschwitz and Hiroshima. The Enlightenment project itself faced fundamental questioning. Theodor Adorno and Max Horkheimer, writing Dialectic of Enlightenment, argued that instrumental reason contained the seeds of its own destruction, that the same rationality that promised liberation could produce industrial genocide. This didn't destroy Voltaire's reputation, but complicated it. Sophisticated readers approached him with more ambivalence, recognizing both the value of his fights against injustice and the limitations of his worldview. The cheerful confidence that reason and commerce would solve everything looked less convincing. His belief in enlightened despotism seemed less benign after 20th century experience with authoritarianism. The prejudices that could be dismissed as period typical in 1900 demanded more serious reckoning in 1970. Yet certain elements proved remarkably durable. His defense of free expression became, if anything, more relevant. As new forms of censorship emerged, technological and social, rather than purely governmental, Voltaire's arguments about the necessity of tolerating offensive speech were rediscovered by each generation. His insistence that people should be free to think and write without fear of persecution resonated across contexts from McCarthyism to campus speech codes to social media controversies. The question of what Voltaire actually believed about free speech produced its own scholarly industry. That famous quote, "I disapprove of what you say, but I will defend to the death your right to say it," appeared everywhere, attributed to Voltaire in countless books and speeches. Except he never said it. The line was written by Evelyn Beatrice Hall in 1906 in a biography of Voltaire, her summary of his attitude. But it captured something true enough that it became impossible to dislodge. Voltaire had defended the right of people to express ideas he found stupid, dangerous, or offensive, even if he'd never phrased it quite so memorably. His methodology influenced investigative journalism more than philosophy. The way he'd approached the Callas case, gathering documents, interviewing witnesses, building a public case through published appeals, this became a model for advocacy journalism. Émile Zola's J'accuse during the Dreyfus affair followed the Voltairean pattern, a prominent writer using public platforms to challenge an unjust verdict, mobilizing public opinion, refusing to let authorities bury an inconvenient case. The tradition continued through the 20th century, wherever writers took up specific causes and fought them in public view. Human Rights Watch investigating abuses, Amnesty International publicising political prisoners, journalists exposing wrongful convictions. These inherited something from Voltaire's approach, even when practitioners had never read his pamphlets. The basic method: document injustice, publicise it, pressure authorities through public attention, shame them into reform. This proved endlessly replicable across different legal and political systems. His literary influence proved harder to trace, but more pervasive. The conte philosophique, the philosophical tale he'd perfected, shaped everything from science fiction to satirical novels. When Aldous Huxley wrote Brave New World, or George Orwell wrote Animal Farm, they were working in a tradition Voltaire had established, using fictional worlds to critique real ones, making philosophical arguments through narrative rather than treatise. The approach became so standard that its origins were forgotten, but Voltaire had shown that ideas could be smuggled past resistance through entertainment. Television and film discovered him repeatedly. Candide was adapted dozens of times, never quite successfully. The novella resisted dramatisation because its genius lay in tone and compression. Stretched to feature length, the relentless accumulation of disasters became exhausting rather than darkly comic. But the influence appeared in subtler forms. Any satire that took an innocent protagonist and dragged them through escalating absurdities owed something to Candide's structure. Voltaire's technique of juxtaposing civilized pretensions against barbaric realities echoed through satire from Dr. Strangelove to The Thick of It. Academic philosophy largely ignored him. Professional philosophers, especially in the analytical tradition that dominated Anglo-American universities after mid-century, found little to work with. He hadn't developed systematic arguments or engaged in the kind of careful conceptual analysis that became philosophy's core method. Continental philosophy was more receptive, but still treated him as a historical figure rather than an active interlocutor. You could write a dissertation on Kant or Hegel engaging with their arguments as live possibilities. Nobody did that with Voltaire. He'd become illustration rather than argument, historical context rather than philosophical resource. But intellectual history claimed him completely. Anyone studying the Enlightenment had to reckon with Voltaire. He'd been too prominent, too prolific, too connected to every major controversy and development of his era to be avoided. Scholars argued about what he represented. Was he the Enlightenment's best exemplar or its worst? Did he embody its universalism or reveal its European parochialism? His contradictions made him useful for multiple narratives. Progressive historians celebrated his fights against injustice. Skeptical post-colonial scholars highlighted his racism and imperialism. Both were accurately citing the same writer. The question of whether Voltaire was fundamentally conservative or radical never reached consensus. His support for enlightened despotism suggested conservatism, comfort with existing hierarchies, so long as they were rational. His mockery of religion and authority suggested radicalism, willingness to undermine any established institution. The reality was that he'd operated according to different categories. He wanted reform, not revolution, improvement, not overthrow, reason, not tradition, but also order, not chaos. This made him simultaneously conservative and radical, depending on which comparison you emphasized. His relationship to religion continued generating fresh interpretations. The simple story, Voltaire the atheist fighter against religious superstition, collapsed under closer examination. He clearly believed in God, just not the Christian God of revelation and miracles. He'd been a deist, convinced that design implied designer, that the universe's order proved an ordering intelligence. But his deism was thin, offering nothing like traditional religious comfort or meaning. The watchmaker God who'd wound up the universe and stepped back provided no providence answered no prayers, offered no afterlife worth hoping for. Was this religious belief or atheism with a vestigial god attached? Different eras found different Voltaires. The 18th century knew him primarily as dramatist and poet. The 19th rediscovered him as historian and philosopher. The 20th emphasized the polemicist and campaigner. The 21st has been excavating the businessman and network builder, fascinated by how he'd constructed his influence through strategic relationships and media manipulation. Each generation needed something different and found it. His wealth remained startling. Adjusted for inflation and economic growth, Voltaire died one of history's richest writers, comparable to successful tech entrepreneurs in contemporary terms. This sat uncomfortably with the romantic notions of the struggling artist or disinterested philosopher. He'd made money deliberately and enjoyed it thoroughly, investing shrewdly, living luxuriously, using wealth to secure independence. The image clashed with the suffering satirist or the humble sage, but it explained how he'd maintained his freedom. Money had purchased the ability to write what he wanted, publish what others feared, and survive the consequences. Modern France struggled with him. The secular republic he'd helped inspire remained officially committed to his values, but 21st century France was more diverse, more religious, and more skeptical of Enlightenment universalism than Third Republic ideologues had imagined. Muslim French citizens noted that Voltaire's attacks on religious fanaticism focused overwhelmingly on Christianity and Islam, treating the latter as civilizational enemy. When controversy erupted over Charlie Hebdo cartoons, both sides invoked Voltaire. Defenders cited his commitment to free expression and mockery of religious pretension. Critics noted his racism and questioned whether satire that reinforced marginalization of already marginalized groups matched his legacy. The debate revealed how completely Conte XT determined meaning. The tricentenary of his birth in 1994 produced dutiful commemorations, but little enthusiasm. French intellectuals gave speeches praising his courage and influence while acknowledging his limitations. The celebrations felt obligatory rather than passionate. Unlike Rousseau, who still inspired genuine devotion or hatred, Voltaire had become respectable, which meant neutered. Everyone agreed he was important. Nobody found him dangerous anymore, yet specific aspects kept resurfacing. His demand that judicial proceedings be transparent and subject to public scrutiny became relevant whenever wrongful convictions were exposed. His insistence that torture was both immoral and unreliable echoed through debates after Abu Ghraib and Sihoy black sites. His mockery of people who claimed certainty about unknowable things applied to climate deniers and internet conspiracy theorists as readily as to 18th century theologians. The particular arguments dated, but the argumentative posture remained current. Digital culture discovered him as meme material. "I disapprove of what you say, but I will defend to the death your right to say it," circulated endlessly, still misattributed, now as image macros and social media posts. Candide's "we must cultivate our garden" became shorthand for focusing on what you could control rather than despairing over what you couldn't. Quotes were stripped from context, simplified, weaponized in arguments Voltaire could never have imagined. This was distortion, but also survival. Ideas stayed alive by mutating. Scholars kept producing biographies, each reflecting its era's concerns. 19th century lives emphasized his literary achievement and philosophical importance. Mid-20th century biographies focused on political courage and religious skepticism. Recent works explored his business acumen, his relationship with women, his participation in colonial economic systems. The documentary record was so extensive that biographers could find evidence for almost any interpretation. Tens of thousands of letters survived, along with published works, contemporary accounts, legal records, and financial documents. You could construct a Voltaire for any purpose. His plays, once considered his most important works, became his most dated. The tragedies that had made him famous were almost never performed. Audiences accustomed to Shakespeare found them stiff and rhetorical. The classical unities he'd respected seemed arbitrary constraints. The Alexandrine verse felt artificial. Even scholars of 18th century theatre struggled to make them feel vital. They remained historically significant, but theatrically dead. The comedies fared slightly better, but still felt like period pieces. Only Candide maintained genuine popularity, taught in schools, adapted regularly, still capable of surprising readers with its darkness and energy. His correspondence became treasure trove for researchers. The letters revealed someone more complex than the public persona suggested. He was capable of genuine warmth and loyalty toward friends, petty vindictiveness toward enemies, anxiety about reputation, pleasure in gossip, concern for practical details of daily life. The private Voltaire was funnier and meaner than the public one, less consistently noble but more human. Reading the letters made clear that the Enlightenment sage was also a calculating operator, a nervous performer, a man who worried about money and status and whether people liked him. Certain reputational problems proved impossible to resolve. His anti-Semitism wasn't peripheral, but central to his view of Christianity. He'd attacked Judaism as primitive and cruel, specifically to undermine Christianity's claim to divine origin. If the Hebrew Bible was barbaric mythology, then Christianity built on that foundation collapsed. This was strategic anti-Semitism, deployed for anti-Christian purposes, but it was still anti-Semitism. 20th century readers couldn't bracket this the way earlier generations had. After the Holocaust, casual references to Jewish greed or dishonesty or primitive religion couldn't be waved away as period-typical prejudice. They had helped create the ideological groundwork for genocide. Defenders argued that Voltaire's anti-Semitism was religious rather than racial, that he'd opposed Judaism as a set of beliefs rather than Jews as a people, that he'd supported Jewish civil rights, even while attacking their religion. Critics responded that this distinction was historically naive, that religious anti-Semitism had always enabled racial anti-Semitism, that Voltaire's rhetoric had fed into traditions that culminated in extermination. The debate couldn't be resolved because both sides were partially right. His prejudices were conventional for his time and class. That didn't make them less harmful or more excusable. Universities continued teaching him, but with increasing layers of contextualization. Candide appeared on syllabi, accompanied by warnings about dated racial language and discussions of 18th century prejudices. Professors felt obligated to explain that while Voltaire was important historically, students shouldn't take his views on race, religion, or gender as models. This created odd pedagogical moments. Students were supposed to admire his courage in fighting injustice, while condemning his participation in other injustices. They should appreciate his satirical brilliance while recognizing his moral blindness. The complexity was probably healthy, but made him harder to teach than more straightforwardly admirable figures. His feminism, such as it was, looked better than his views on race, but still limited. He'd argued that women were intellectually equal to men and should receive better education. He'd featured intelligent female characters in his works and maintained intellectual friendships with brilliant women. But his personal relationships with women were consistently exploitative, and his writings on gender never questioned fundamental hierarchies. He wanted women to be educated companions, not equal citizens. This was progressive for the 18th century, and conservative by any modern standard. The environmental movement found nothing useful in him. His faith in human domination of nature, his celebration of commerce and development, his assumption that progress meant transformation of wilderness into productivity, all this represented exactly what environmentalists opposed. Voltaire had never questioned whether endless growth was possible or desirable. Nature existed to be used, improved, made rational. The idea that humans might need to limit themselves or preserve ecosystems would have struck him as sentimental primitivism. This was perhaps his most comprehensively dated position, yet his core message about thinking for oneself rather than accepting authority retained force. Doubt is not a pleasant condition, but certainty is absurd captured something perpetually relevant. Every generation faced new orthodoxies demanding unquestioning acceptance, new authorities claiming special access to truth, new certainties that turned out to be provisional at best. The specific targets changed, but the need to question remained. His influence on journalism proved more durable than his influence on philosophy. The investigative reporter building a case through accumulated evidence, the columnist using wit to deflate pomposity, the editorial writer demanding accountability. These inherited Voltairean approaches, even when practitioners had never read him. The assumption that public intellectuals should engage with current events rather than remaining in academic isolation, that writing should be accessible rather than deliberately obscure, that ideas should be tested in public debate rather than confined to specialist journals. All this reflected values Voltaire had embodied, if not invented. His final resting place became symbolic. After the revolution moved his remains to the Pantheon, he'd stayed there through every subsequent regime change. Monarchists who returned after Napoleon's fall didn't remove him. The Second Empire left him untouched. Even Vichy, which attacked everything he represented, didn't dare disturb the tomb. His physical presence in the temple of French greatness was permanent, whatever individual governments thought of his ideas. The bones had won an argument the living man had never quite settled. Museums displayed his contradictions in glass cases. His letters arguing for tolerance sat beside letters dripping with casual bigotry. His treatises on justice were exhibited near financial documents, showing shrewd exploitation of tax loopholes. Curators didn't hide the complexity. The man who'd fought the callous injustice had also profited from investments in slave trading ventures. You couldn't separate the enlightened philosopher from the 18th century opportunist because they were the same person. Modern biographers struggled with the packaging. Earlier generations had written hagiographies celebrating the heroic freethinker. Then came debunking revisions, exposing the hypocrite. Now the approach was usually to present everything and let readers judge, but this created 700-page books that defeated casual interest. The general public wanted to know whether he was good or bad, hero or villain. The honest answer that he was both and neither satisfied nobody. His name became shorthand in arguments he'd never have recognised. Political debates invoked Voltaire to mean whatever the speaker wanted. Libertarians claimed him for his defence of free markets and speech. Progressives cited his attacks on institutional power. Nationalists ignored him entirely or classified him as a rootless cosmopolitan. Internationalists praised his vision of universal human rights. Everyone was right and wrong because they were selecting pieces from a vast and contradictory body of work. The phrase, "I disapprove of what you say but will defend to the death your right to say it," remained his most famous quotation, despite the fact that he'd never said it. Evelyn Beatrice Hall invented the line in 1906 as a summary of his attitude, and it immediately became attributed to him directly. Scholars corrected the attribution endlessly. It made no difference. The fake quote was too perfect, too memorable, too useful. It captured something true about his position, even if the words weren't his. This seemed fitting for someone who'd spent his life rewriting and improving reality. Digital culture discovered him accidentally. Internet arguments about free speech inevitably summoned his ghost. Forums debated whether he'd have supported platform moderation or opposed it. Would he have celebrated the democratization of publishing or lamented the triumph of mediocrity? The question was unanswerable, but people enjoyed the speculation. He became a meme without most users knowing much about the actual person. His plays vanished from repertory almost completely. Occasional academic productions happened, usually in French, sometimes in translation, never to popular success. The problem wasn't just that tastes had changed. The plays were too topical, too tied to specific 18th century controversies. Jokes about contemporary French politics in 1750 meant nothing to audiences in 2020. The philosophical dialogues that interrupted the action felt preachy. The character development was minimal. Even scholars who studied them admitted they worked better as historical documents than living theatre. But Candide refused to die. New translations appeared regularly, each generation finding fresh language for the satire. Graphic novel adaptations reached younger readers. Bernstein's operetta kept a musical version in circulation. High school teachers assigned it knowing students would actually finish it, unlike most 18th century literature. The combination of brevity, humour and accessible philosophy made it nearly indestructible. Pangloss and his optimism remained useful targets whenever someone claimed everything was working out for the best. Universities taught him primarily in history courses now, rather than philosophy. He'd become evidence of Enlightenment thinking rather than a living philosophical voice. Students learned what 18th century intellectuals believed by reading Voltaire, not to discover truth themselves. This would have annoyed him. He'd never wanted to be historical. He'd wanted to change minds in the present. The transformation into a museum piece represented a kind of defeat, even as it guaranteed continued attention. France maintained complicated ownership. He was undeniably central to French identity and history, but his relationship with Frenchness had always been ambivalent. He'd spent years in exile, had preferred English politics to French, had made his fortune in Geneva rather than Paris, had written constantly in a language he'd simultaneously elevated and criticised. The revolution had claimed him posthumously, but he'd have been horrified by the terror. Every French government since had projected its values onto him and found some justification. His correspondence became more valuable than his published works to scholars. The letters showed the working mind, the daily thoughts, the unpolished reactions. 20,000 pieces of correspondence survived, creating an almost overwhelming archive. Reading through them revealed someone funnier, pettier, more generous, more spiteful, more human than the philosophical works suggested. He gossiped, complained about his health, begged for news, settled scores, helped friends, destroyed enemies, all in prose that crackled with energy. The property at Ferney became a museum, preserved as it was during his final years. Tourists walked through rooms where he'd written, saw the theatre he'd built, visited the church he'd constructed with its dedication to God alone, not any saint. The irony of a pilgrimage site dedicated to someone who'd mocked pilgrimages was noted by everyone and bothered nobody. People wanted to stand where he'd stood, to feel proximity to that vanished world. His religious views remained his most misrepresented aspect. Atheists claimed him as one of their own despite his repeated insistence on deism. Believers pointed to his theism while ignoring his contempt for organized religion. The truth was he'd believed in a creator God while finding every existing religion corrupt and absurd. This satisfied nobody in later theological debates, which preferred clear positions. His arguments against atheism looked weak to modern skeptics. His attacks on Christianity offended believers. He existed in a position that had lost most of its constituency. The clandestine manuscripts he'd circulated proved more radical than his published works. Things he'd written for private circulation, among trusted friends, went further than anything he'd risk printing under his name. These underground texts denied biblical miracles, mocked religious ceremonies, and portrayed priests as deliberate frauds rather than sincere believers in falsehood. Scholars debated which clandestine works were genuinely his and which were attributed to him for credibility. The question mattered because the underground Voltaire was significantly more aggressive than the public version. Financial historians found his business dealings fascinating. He'd understood money in ways most writers didn't, had played markets successfully, had grasped the emerging capitalist system with remarkable sophistication. This made him unusual among philosophers who typically affected disdain for commerce. He'd seen no contradiction between intellectual work and wealth accumulation. Ideas and investments were both ways of engaging with the world. The modern separation between thinkers and doers would have struck him as artificial. His health obsessions filled thousands of pages. He'd complained constantly about imminent death from age 20 onward, living to 83 while predicting his demise annually. The letters chronicled every symptom, every remedy, every doctor's opinion. Modern readers found this tedious, but it revealed someone genuinely anxious about physical vulnerability, convinced his fragile body might fail at any moment. The hypochondria was real, even if the predicted catastrophes never materialized. Historians of science gave him credit for popularizing Newton, while noting he'd misunderstood crucial aspects of the physics. His explanation of gravity was more poetic than accurate. His account of optics contained errors, but he translated complex mathematics into accessible prose and convinced French intellectuals to take English science seriously. The role of interpreter mattered even when the interpretation wasn't perfect. He changed what educated people knew about the universe, even if specialists had to correct his details. The question of his legacy's net impact remained genuinely disputed. Had his attacks on religious authority prepared the ground for secular humanism and human rights? Or had his corrosive skepticism undermined all moral certainty and enabled relativism? Did his defense of free expression create space for democratic discourse? Or did his example of using wit as a weapon encourage bad faith debate and intellectual bullying? Reasonable scholars disagreed. The evidence supported multiple conclusions. His influence on the French language itself was substantial and permanent. Phrases he'd coined entered common usage. His prose style became a model of clarity that later writers either imitated or rebelled against. French students still passed his sentences to learn proper construction. The idea that French was uniquely suited to rational thought, a myth he'd helped propagate, persisted long after its intellectual justification collapsed. 21st century readers encountered him through algorithms. Search engines offered his quotes, usually misattributed or stripped of context. Social media accounts posted his aphorisms over random images. Online encyclopedias summarized his positions in bullet points. This fragmentation was the opposite of how he'd worked. He'd built arguments through accumulation, had used repetition and variation to hammer points home, had embedded ideas in narratives. The reduction to isolated sentences betrayed the method even when the sentences were genuinely his. Academic specialization made comprehensive understanding harder. Scholars of his political thought didn't necessarily know his poetry. Experts on his historical writing might not have read the scientific works. Specialists in his correspondence could be unfamiliar with the plays. The sheer volume defeated mastery. Nobody alive had read everything he'd written and absorbed it thoroughly. The man himself had become too large for individual comprehension. Yet certain students still discovered him with the shock of recognition that transcends historical distance. Something in the voice, the anger at injustice combined with the refusal to despair, the insistence on laughing at power, the conviction that clear thinking could improve the world. All this occasionally reached across centuries and grabbed someone. These weren't necessarily scholars. Often they were activists, journalists, people fighting contemporary battles who found, in his example, permission to keep fighting. His tomb in the Pantheon received fewer visitors than Rousseau's nearby. The irony would have pleased him. His old rival, the man he'd considered a dangerous sentimentalist, attracted more pilgrims. But Voltaire's influence had never depended on veneration. He'd wanted readers, not worshippers. The ideas mattered, not the memorial. He'd built monuments in prose, not stone. The contradictions never resolved. Every attempt to create a unified theory of Voltaire collapsed under the weight of counter-evidence. He was an authoritarian liberal, a skeptical believer, a subversive defender of order, a cosmopolitan patriot. The inconsistencies weren't flaws in interpretation, but accurate reflections of someone who changed positions, contradicted himself, and refused to be systematized. His final lesson was perhaps that intellectual honesty requires accepting complexity. The Enlightenment he'd embodied wasn't a simple triumph of reason over superstition. It was a messy, compromised, partial advance carried out by flawed people with mixed motives. Progress happened through the efforts of individuals who were simultaneously enlightened and blind, generous and selfish, brave and calculating. Purity was a fantasy. Change came through imperfect action. The man who'd signed his letters, "Écraser l'infâme," had crushed some infamies while participating in others. He'd expanded human freedom in some directions while accepting oppression in others. He'd seen clearly in certain areas while remaining willfully blind elsewhere. This made him representative rather than exceptional. Most people who change the world do so incompletely, advancing some causes while failing others. His voice still echoes in every argument against dogma, every demand that authority justify itself, every insistence that we can think our way to better arrangements. The specific battles he fought are finished. The wars he cared about are footnotes. The people he attacked are forgotten. But the stance remains, the attitude of questioning, doubting, demanding evidence, refusing to accept that things must be as they are. And perhaps that's enough for any thinker's legacy, to have established not a system, but an approach, not answers, but better questions, not certainty, but the productive restlessness that keeps seeking improvement. Voltaire gave us permission to doubt, tools for criticism, and evidence that one person's voice could matter. The rest, as he might have said with characteristic impatience, is up to us. The books kept selling. Translations multiplied. Academic conferences devoted panels to interpreting his contradictions. Publishers issued new critical editions with updated annotations. None of it would have surprised him. He'd built his work to last, had constructed arguments designed to survive beyond immediate context, had written with an eye toward posterity, even while claiming not to care about posthumous reputation. What he couldn't have anticipated was how thoroughly the world would change around his ideas. The religious conflicts he'd fought became historical curiosities in secular Europe. The absolute monarchies he'd navigated collapsed into democracies and republics. The torture he'd campaigned against was abolished. The judicial reforms he'd demanded became standard practice. His victories were so complete, they became invisible, absorbed into assumptions that seemed natural rather than fought-for achievements. But new battles emerged wearing old disguises. Religious fanaticism found fresh justifications. Authorities discovered novel methods of suppression. Propaganda adapted to new media. Each generation faced its own versions of the problems he'd attacked, requiring renewed applications of the basic principle: question authority, demand evidence, refuse certainty, defend the right to speak and think freely. His method proved more transferable than his conclusions. You didn't need to accept his deism or his politics or his economics to learn from his approach. The technique of using wit to expose absurdity, of building cases through accumulated detail, of mobilizing public opinion against institutional injustice, these could be adapted to contexts he'd never imagined. Civil rights lawyers, investigative journalists, human rights advocates, they inherited tools he'd refined even when they'd never studied his work directly. The racism and anti-Semitism couldn't be excused or explained away. They were real, harmful, and part of the intellectual foundation for later atrocities. Acknowledging his contributions to human freedom required simultaneously acknowledging his participation in systems of oppression. Both truths stood. The complexity was the point. Progress comes through imperfect people making partial advances while remaining blind to other injustices. Understanding this prevents both naive hero worship and cynical dismissal. France kept arguing about him because France kept arguing about itself. Every debate over secularism, free expression, national identity, or the meaning of Enlightenment values circled back to Voltaire eventually. He'd become inextricable from French self-understanding, for better and worse. The tomb in the Pantheon was less a memorial than an ongoing conversation, each generation projecting its concerns onto the bones beneath the marble. The global reach surprised everyone. His works appeared in Chinese, Arabic, Japanese, Swahili, languages and cultures he'd barely known existed. The specificity of his 18th century French context didn't prevent translation into radically different circumstances. Something about the core arguments, stripped of their original setting, retained force. The demand for justice, the skepticism toward authority, the insistence on independent thought. These proved oddly universal, even when emerging from a particular time and place. Digital immortality gave him a strange half-life. His texts existed in dozens of online formats, searchable and accessible to anyone with internet connection. This was democratization he'd have celebrated, making ideas available without gatekeepers or institutional control. But it also enabled the fragmentation and decontextualization he'd have hated. Quotes circulated divorced from arguments. Positions were simplified into sound bites. The careful constructions he'd built were disassembled into spare parts for other people's purposes. Students still encountered him, usually through Candide, occasionally through the letters on toleration, rarely through anything else. Teachers made the standard moves: acknowledge the brilliance, note the prejudices, explain the historical context, extract the relevant lessons. Some students connected, found something that resonated despite the centuries of distance. Most filed him away as required reading, important but remote. A few discovered the actual person behind the reputation and fell down the rabbit hole of his massive output, emerging months later with stacks of notes and the queasy recognition that genius and moral failure could inhabit the same skull. The question he'd spent his life asking remained unanswered. How do we build just societies? How do we balance order and freedom? How do we protect the vulnerable without empowering the tyrannical? Every generation took its turn proposing solutions, implementing reforms, discovering unintended consequences, and starting the process again. The work was never finished. Perhaps that was his deepest insight. That improvement was iterative, that progress required constant vigilance, that each achievement created new problems requiring fresh solutions. He'd wanted to crush the infamous thing, l'infâme, but the infamous thing kept regenerating in new forms. Fanaticism, superstition, cruelty justified by certainty, these proved remarkably resilient. Each defeat was temporary, each victory partial. The fight continued because human nature contained both the capacity for reason and the temptation toward unreason, both the impulse toward justice and the comfort of prejudice. Voltaire had understood this tension, even as he'd embodied it. His legacy was the insistence that we must keep fighting despite the impossibility of final victory. The garden at Ferney remained. Tourists walked paths he'd walked, stood where he'd stood, tried to imagine the vanished world he'd inhabited. The actual ground provided no special insight. History had happened there and then moved on. The words survived better than the place. That would have satisfied him. He'd always trusted writing more than monuments. had believed ink lasted longer than stone. His last great battle was against the certainty that any battle would be his last. He'd kept working until the final weeks, kept writing letters, kept revising manuscripts, kept fighting. The performance continued until the body failed completely. There was no deathbed wisdom, no final summation, just the abrupt cessation of a voice that had filled 60 years with argument. The silence after was probably louder than any last words could have been. What remains is the work itself. Thousands of pages of prose that still moves, still provokes, still challenges. Not all of it aged well. Not all of it deserved to. But buried in the mass are arguments that retain their edge, insights that cut through time, examples of how one person's clear thinking and moral courage could bend the arc of history towards something better. He didn't bend it far enough. He didn't bend it in all the right directions, but he bent it, and the bending mattered. The unfinished business passed to those who came after. Each generation inherited the work of criticism and reform, the task of questioning authority and defending freedom, the responsibility of fighting injustice wherever it appeared. Voltaire had shown it was possible. The methods and tools were available. The outcome was never guaranteed, but silence and surrender were worse than fighting and failing. His pen had been more dangerous than armies, not because it commanded force, but because it changed minds, and changed minds eventually changed everything else. The power of clear argument, sharp wit, and relentless publicity to challenge institutional authority and mobilize public opinion, this was the discovery that outlived him. Writers still wield that power. Activists still deploy those tactics. The battle continues in different languages against different enemies, but the fundamental struggle, reason against unreason, justice against cruelty, freedom against oppression, this remains unchanged. He would have hated being made respectable. The statues and commemorations and academic conferences would have amused and annoyed him in equal measure. He'd wanted to be read, not worshipped. He'd wanted his arguments to win, not his reputation to be burnished. The transformation into historical monument was inevitable, but represented a kind of failure. Dead philosophers become safe. Their words get carved in marble and emptied of danger. The living Voltaire had been genuinely threatening to established powers. The commemorated Voltaire threatened no one. But occasionally, someone reads past the monument to the actual words, discovers the anger and urgency beneath the reputation, and recognizes something necessary. The fight against l'infâme, whatever form it currently takes, requires weapons. Voltaire spent his life forging them. They're still available to anyone willing to pick them up and learn to use them. The infamous thing hasn't been crushed. The work continues. The garden still needs cultivation,